And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hydepark on Other Derana 24. The International Monetary Fund has urged strong revenue measures in 2016 during discussions with the Sri Lankan government as the mission concludes its visit here in Sri Lanka, and also has spoken about Sri Lanka's macroeconomic stability. Here at Hydepark, we have the privilege of speaking with the mission chief for Sri Lanka of the International Monetary Fund, who's visiting us, Mr. Papageorgiou. A very warm welcome, and Ayubowan to you.
It's good to be with you, Indeewari. Thank you for having me.
Certainly, it's a pleasure to have you here. We have a number of questions to ask you, but first, I think in your end of mission statement, you've outlined some of the key reforms Sri Lanka has ensured and also how far we have to go. You're talking about the sustaining the reform momentum, that it's critical, and safeguarding macroeconomic stability. What kind of discussions have you had with Sri Lankan authorities here, and what has the feedback been?
This time our visit was relatively short. It was just a week meeting with the authorities and a wide range of private sector and other entities. As always, we're very thankful for the hospitality of the Sri Lankan people and the government. The discussion was wide-ranging. It was following up on the issues that we had raised upon the completion of our fourth review, and that still remains our guiding principle for how we engage. Obviously, there was a wide-ranging issues that were brought into the discussion, and we were very happy always to see the strong commitment of the authorities, including His Excellency the President.
You mentioned the fourth review. I think we'd like to ask you the key reforms that led to the approval of the fourth IMF review, and given the earlier reporting breach that was spoken of, what prompted the board's confidence to proceed with the review, and what safeguards are now in place to ensure transparency by Sri Lankan authorities going forward?
In order to complete any review, the IMF Executive Board has to be assured and has to be certain that a member country under a program arrangement is on track with its stated objectives under a program. And like any program review, this one did exactly that. There were two board meetings that took place and went a long way in reassuring the board and ensuring the continuation of the program. On July 1st of this year, the IMF Executive Board reviewed the program material and performance from our previous visit in April. They reviewed the progress that Sri Lanka has made, and alongside of that, a set of performance criteria, structural benchmarks, and indicative targets.
Right.
Some examples of these structural benchmarks include the enactment of the asset recovery law, the reinstatement of parate executions, the publication of the VAT capital compliance improvement plan, and additional ones. There were also two prior actions that were taken into consideration, both relating to electricity. The first was on restoring electricity cost recovery, and the second one was on ensuring that the automatic tariff adjustment mechanism based on the bulk supply transaction account was reinstated and it's working going ahead. This is something that we'll continue discussing with the authorities based on this discussion. You mentioned obviously the inadvertent underreporting of some data. The executive board of the IMF considered evidence from a letter and a report from the managing director of the IMF, laying out the parameters and the circumstances upon which that underreporting took place. That reporting was related to the stock of central government expenditure arrears,
right.
And the board took into consideration the circumstances under which it happened, the authorities' explanations and the subsequent corrective actions that were associated with that. We engaged with the authorities to a great length, clearly and openly, and we reached agreement on understanding the circumstances under which this data underreporting took place, and we have assurances that there are corrective actions in place, which include a proper reporting and proper commitment control in preventing similar arrears from taking place in the future, as well as clearing these arrears within a period of 2 years.
And the IMF is satisfied with the kind of commitments given by the Sri Lankan side?
Yes, we are.
I'd like to move on to talk about the ongoing developments from a more regional and global angle as well. Has the IMF been kept in the loop or informed about Sri Lanka's trade negotiations with the United States in terms of the reciprocal tariffs imposed?
We understand that the authorities are in negotiation with U.S. authorities over the reciprocal tariffs and the trade agreement. Obviously, as you know, on April 2nd, the level of reciprocal tariffs for Sri Lanka was set at 44%, and then on July 9th, that level was set at 30%. Obviously, this will take place, this level of tariffs will take place from the current 10% of the base tariff to the 30% on August 1st, and we look forward to seeing the outcome of any eventual outcome of the negotiations. So we're paying very, very close attention to these developments.
Certainly, to add to that, I'd like to ask you, on the statement, I think the IMF talks about that it's critical to build Sri Lanka's resilience to shocks, especially in the context of ongoing trade policy uncertainty and heightened geopolitical tensions. Is this a concern? Have these developments affected the IMF's forecasts or risk assessments related to Sri Lanka? And what impact do you foresee on foreign earnings through employment and recovery?
Let me first say, Indeewari, that we acknowledge that the global trade policy uncertainty raises a lot of risks for many countries, including Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's particular export profile and the composition of its export portfolio does present a certain amount of risks that could be associated or could pan out under some scenarios. So this is something that we have paid very close attention, including also in the fourth review that was concluded on July 1st that I mentioned. Under that work that we have done, we try to estimate and gauge what the effect of a trade disruption, be it from tariffs or something else, would be. And in this case, assuming a 44% tariff and the configuration of other partners, other trading partner countries' tariffs, we had estimated that the effect on Sri Lanka's exports could lead to a decline of as much as 3% of GDP. And then in terms of the real level of economic activity, that could create a level shift down by as much as 1.5%, which can be significant over the long term. So these are very important considerations that we continue looking to this day. We will have to see what happens with trade negotiations, and then we will have to react accordingly.
Does this mean the IMF sees Sri Lanka's heavy reliance on a few export markets like the United States as a systemic risk?
It is the export profile of Sri Lanka, and the composition of its exports does have its own unique characteristics, and in this case it may merit a little bit more attention. Obviously, export diversification is something important and something that we have discussed with the authorities to a great extent.
I'd like to talk about foreign direct investments too, why trade diversification and FDI reform remains critical at this juncture for Sri Lanka's recovery. And to add to it, what structural weaknesses in Sri Lanka's current growth model that the International Monetary Fund as the global lender wants to address at this stage?
Indeewari, first and foremost, macroeconomic stability is a very important parameter for long-term growth and sustainable and strong growth. Beyond that, it's an issue of enacting a series of structural policies and structural reforms that will address any particular issues that put the country on a disadvantage, or that need to address outstanding issues. So there, obviously, you mentioned FDI. It is worth understanding that even before we are having the current discussion about the level of tariffs that Sri Lanka may be exposed to, Sri Lanka has had a relatively low level both of FDI and low level of exports of goods as a percent of GDP when you compare it to other peer economies or other economies in the region. And in particular for FDI, as you mentioned, if you look across time as a percent of GDP, Sri Lanka's level tends to be low, tends to be below 2% of GDP for a long period. And for a country that needs to continue growing, continue investing in a more sustainable path, that is obviously of paramount importance to continue getting some strong FDI. So attracting FDI is a multi-pronged process that relies on policy continuity, good policies overall, low corruption, strong rule of law, and associated other policies. Same goes for trade and trade policies. There are a lot of recommendations that we had included in the fourth review and we are actively discussing. These include an array of issues relating to trade facilitation, including also the national window, the national single window, free trade agreements, obviously, the ability to provide and public infrastructure upgrade where it's needed, and where it's where it's needed more for where investment is lacking, creating the preconditions by allowing more greater expediting labor reforms to remove labor rigidities, and also hopefully increase female labor force participation. These are all very important issues. Potentially improving the investment environment and allowing public-private partnerships to take place where appropriate, and in general create a more conducive environment for investment.
Are there any examples that you can share of countries that Sri Lanka can look to as models in such process? And to add to that question, I'd like to follow up with the kind of indicators that the International Monetary Fund uses to measure long-term resilience of a nation, its economy, and how Sri Lanka is performing on those lines.
In terms of examples, it is generally a good idea to have a custom idea of what works for each country. And so what would work for a AAA country may not work for Sri Lanka, and vice versa. Because Sri Lanka has unique characteristics, very well situated where it is geographically, and having a dynamism that remains to be unlocked, I would say that it needs to look within the set of advice that has already been given, and that it does very well. And we are doing that with the authorities as well as other development partners with the government. In terms of metrics or other variables that we are looking, there's a wide array of issues that we always evaluate and constantly and in its review. Obviously, those relating to the fiscal sector or debt or the external sector, such as, for example, the primary balance or the level of debt, especially after post-restructuring, as well as the level of reserves. And all of them have shown great improvement across the last few years, since the bottom of the crisis, and we're hoping this to continue being maintained and seeing more improvement. This is something that we look very closely. Obviously, as you know, the economy itself is doing very well. The recovery has been undeniable. Even as early as the first quarter of this year, this dynamism and this strong growth is continuing, and we're very happy about this. But we think more needs to be done. More needs to be done to continue bringing investment back into the country inviting putting the foundation of a long-term and sustainable growth. Strong positive growth is very, very important, but long-term sustainable growth is far more important because it's what's going to push the economy forward for the next few years and decades.
Certainly. We're talking about the Ceylon Electricity Board restructuring. While unbundling is agreed in principle, there are public concerns about potential tariff hikes. Is the IMF concerned, or what's the IMF view about unbundling under state control? And we also want to know whether this is sufficient in this current context. The question is really how reform can be balanced with affordability.
From the IMF's perspective, any reforms of the electricity sector should be credible, should be transparent, and should have a broad buy-in from all relevant stakeholders with a view towards preserving what is good about the current arrangements and making sure that the fiscal implications or the fiscal impacts are managed or are minimal. So with that regard, we continue to pay close attention, including on the unbundling and on any sort of implications for the program and for the performance of the electricity sector. We believe state ownership may have a role to play, but we are somewhat agnostic in that what should be the role and what should be the speed at which this is going to take place with respect to the unbundling and the initial phase of unbundling.
Is the IMF view that privatization of partial listing should follow unbundling in the long term?
So the EFF program doesn't have a view on the ownership model that the electricity sector has to have. Potentially under state control, a lot of the operation of the electricity company can continue being done on an even footing where it creates long-term sustainability and good outcomes for everybody, including also for the consumer, creating a good and reliable electricity grid all the way from generation, transmission, and distribution, and then something that is conducive for economic growth. There is nothing wrong with being under state control. That being said, inviting in new investment, potentially private investment, or PPPs, public-private partnerships, could unlock additional potential into the electricity company, could give investor confidence, could give ways for the electricity company and utilities in general to be able to invest more into potentially renewable sources of energy, something that could also benefit Sri Lanka itself, potentially lower the cost of tariffs and be beneficial both for the state by not incurring any additional liabilities, as well as the consumer.
The kind of reforms implemented in Sri Lanka also brings us the question about how or when Sri Lanka will see more space for eased cost of living, better living standards. So the IMF continues to emphasize on revenue mobilization through value-added tax and property taxes, and Sri Lanka still is grappling with high cost of living. So the question is how much fiscal space exists within the parameters of the EFF program for Sri Lanka to look at improving the living standards while bringing down cost of living that we've seen rise in Sri Lanka.
So obviously the cost of living, the crisis of the cost of living is hopefully behind us. The rate of inflation has come down quite a lot. In fact, we have been dealing with the opposite, with deflation for the last few quarters, and we think that inflation is on its way towards a sustainable path around the central bank's inflation target of around 5%. So in that regard, we think that the worst of the cost of living crisis as a general over an inflationary environment is hopefully squarely behind us. But you are right, Indeewari, protecting the poor and vulnerable is very important and should continue being a primary importance for the government. and for all stakeholders. People have been through a lot in this program, and those who have suffered the most are the ones who can also afford it the least. And so the program has, one of the pillars of the program is promoting greater integration of the social safety net into the government's central policies, and also with an explicit nod to the fiscal behavior and the fiscal response of the government. So when we say about rebuilding fiscal space or maintaining a prudent fiscal policy, already assumes that there will be a certain level of spending. In fact, spending for social purposes and protecting the poor and vulnerable is so important that it's actually an indicative target into our program, so that we are urging and we are hoping that the authorities will keep up with the type of spending that is needed to support those who need it the most. And all throughout society, even including with electricity, for example, there is an explicit nod, an explicit provision in allowing for better differentiation, for example, for tariffs for vulnerable households or households that don't consume as much electricity.
Are SMEs a focus?
SMEs are important because they are a source of strong labor gains. They employ traditionally a lot of labor. They are very flexible. They tend to weather economic crisis better, or they tend to bounce back after an economic crisis. They are very important, and how they are, the incentives they are given and the environment they are given to thrive should be important in any program. In the current program, we're looking at many parameters on this, including also on having a better fiscal environment and a better tax treatment, creating the conditions for more investment for everyone, and facilitating trade through the national single window and other additional priorities.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you what message from the International Monetary Fund, as the mission chief, you have for the people of Sri Lanka. A portion of the public remains skeptical of the IMF program and concerned about what the cost of these reforms are going to be, not just on the economy, but the people, the vulnerable communities, on everyday life, and what we can realistically expect in the next 12 months to come.
So I have had the honor of being the mission chief for Sri Lanka for the better part of 4 to 5 months now. I have been surprised positively every time I come about the resilience and the ingenuity of Sri Lankans, all the way obviously from the government, the private sector, people that we meet on a regular basis, as well as those we engage, in academia and in think tanks and the civil, the CSOs and other organizations. So there is a large commitment from everybody to continue seeing things through. Obviously, the country has been through a lot. Just 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, things were in a much more difficult situation. There was an economic crisis and a humanitarian crisis, and we hope that this is squarely behind us, and we have already seen all the conditions of this being satisfied. Looking ahead, the first half of the program, if you will, was about stabilizing, making macroeconomic adjustments and stabilizing the real economy. The second half of the program is the one that we think will put the foundation in for long-term sustainable growth. And I keep referring to it because I think it's very important. The reforms that are taking place right now, the upgrade on governance, on reduction of corruption, and the greater checks and balances is what will continue having Sri Lanka being on a sustainable and long-term path. I believe the next 12 months will be better. There's always risks, but with implementation of these reforms, we hope to continue seeing growth being strong, inflation being on target, and the both fiscal and external buffers continue being built that will benefit everyone.
Moving back to our conversation on tariffs and ongoing negotiations between Sri Lanka and the United States. I'd like to ask you about a claim made by Sri Lanka's former President Ranil Wickremesinghe that US tariffs breached official creditor committee obligations. Now, does the International Monetary Fund view such unilateral trade actions as a risk to the credibility of Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process, and what are the expectations from official creditors in an IMF-backed restructuring process?
The role of the IMF in a debt restructuring process is to intermediate discussions between creditor and debtor entities, and this is all through the lens of neutrality that we always adhere to. I can just say that in general the debt restructuring process is doing very well. It's nearly complete. With the completion of the ISB restructuring, the external bonds in last year with the private creditors, and the ongoing bilateral debt restructuring that is going place and is going very well, is almost complete. And we look forward to its final completion, which will put Sri Lanka's debt into a new paradigm about sustainability.
If a member state acts outside collective terms, could that delay debt treatment from others? Does the IMF play a role in mediating?
No, we do not. We have a state of neutrality.
You mentioned the second part is about long-term sustainable growth. Do you see Sri Lanka on track?
Yes, I do. I do. And I hope that the momentum will continue. The momentum of reforms is firmly in place. And with the assistance of the IMF and other development partners that the authorities will find more opportunities to put in place all that is needed to see it through.
Thank you very much for your time here at Hyde Park amidst your very busy and short visit here in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Indeewari.
We were in conversation with the International Monetary Fund's Mission Chief for Sri Lanka, Evan Papageorgiou, talking to us about the IMF's visit in Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's performance in relation to the extended fund facility extended by the global lender. We'll see you again, once again, with another discussion here at Hyde Park. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.